Hi guys, BuildZoid here, and today we're going to be taking a look at my very first motherboard. Yes, this right here is the motherboard that started it all, the ASUS ROG Rampage for Extreme. This motherboard is basically directly responsible for my interest in extreme overclocking and well, basically why this YouTube channel exists. So the story basically goes, this was the motherboard I built my first self-built computer with. And because it's an ASUS ROG motherboard, I stumbled across the ASUS ROG blog. On the ASUS ROG blog, they'd have posts about overclocking, including LN2 overclocking, and, I basically went, whoa, that is the coolest stuff ever, and here we are. That's basically how that went. That's the very simplified version of that. So, yeah, this motherboard is basically responsible for AHOC existing right now, so... yeah, if you're a fan of the channel, you should be very, very grateful to this board right here, because without it, this channel probably wouldn't exist. Anyway, this thing's got a bunch of extreme overclocking features, and just it's a great board. Because it is the flagship from ASUS for the X79 platform. But yeah, let's dive into it. So first up, postcode. Of course, you have a postcode on this. Then there's a slow mode switch under that, which didn't quite make it into the photo. We've got a power button, reset button, 4-channel dip switch for enabling and disabling PCIe slots. Only the red ones. Unfortunately, this middle slot does not actually have the... You can't disable it with a dip switch, which is a bit of a shame. There's a go button, so this thing is like a mishmash of memo-k, and it also has some kind of profile saving functionality, though I've only ever used it as a memo-k button, and the memo-k button, the old one, there's new ASUS motherboards have something called memo-k2, and it's a switch, and it's stupid. It's the worst. I have no idea how they came up with the memo-k2 functionality being a good thing, but... yeah, it exists and it's terrible. They should remove it. But this old version, the older version of memo-k was basically if you press the button, it would wipe all of your memory settings and all of some of your CPU settings as well. But it wouldn't change say VRM settings, power settings, that kind of thing. It wouldn't adjust those. So it was basically a nice, convenient, soft BIOS reset. So yeah, that's what I used it for, and that's the go button. Then you've got voltage read points with actual connectors for proper voltage, multimeter probe hookups. Well, the hookups that this motherboard comes with are actually terrible for multimeters for whatever reason. There's some that have really nice, snug, round fitting sockets. The ones that this board came with were they weren't round. Basically they were relying on the heat shrink around the basically you had this little metal U thing at the end of them, and you had to rely on the heat shrink to basically press the probe in, and just awful. I didn't really like it very much, and oops, I just hit the mic with my pen. So I mean stylus, it's not really a pen, but anyway. Yeah, so it does come with actual hookups, but the hookups that provided with the motherboard kind of suck. Now, the cool thing is, though, that this connector is actually pretty, standard, so you can actually use other probe hookups that suck less if you want to. And then there are, of course, just solder bumps on the motherboard to indicate, if you don't want to use these, then, solder bumps. And there's more voltage read point solder bumps along the 24-pin. These are the important overclocking voltages. These are the voltages that you basically look for. If there's something wrong with the motherboard, it might be a good idea to check check the ones down here. These are more for diagnostics than actual day-to-day overclocking use. Then down here, actually no, we shouldn't go to that. These headers over here. Oh, and LN2 mode header. Which I actually lost the jumper for that, so that's a bit of an issue. But yeah, there's an LN2 mode header over there. But these two headers over here, those are the VGA hotwire functionality. Now, this eventually got moved off of the motherboard, but the idea behind this is it works... it's basically volt modding functionality for GPUs built into the motherboard. So you could actually... it basically works the same way as a potentiometer mod, except instead of having a potentiometer that you have to adjust with a screwdriver, if you use the VGA hotwire with this board, you can actually set the voltage of your GPUs from the BIOS of the motherboard, which is kind of cool, but at the same time, I kind of think this is a bit janky in terms of like I never used it myself. I'd honestly and looking at it now, because like the thing is like well, there's been a lot of progress in terms of my overclocking since I actually like regularly use this board. I still have it. Like I've not gotten rid of it. There's no way I'm getting rid of it. Um, but like even if it dies, I'm not letting this thing go. So yeah, but the thing is, like looking back at it, like the VGA hot wire functionality, which I never used in the past, like these days I'd probably just use a potentiometer anyway. It just seems more convenient to me. But yeah, still cool idea. ASUS eventually moved this into the OC panel that comes with some of the later motherboards that they released. And yeah, and it no longer comes on the motherboard, because I guess that's the other thing, is just like it really ties you down to just like a couple ASUS boards in terms of, you know, your volt modding capability. But the same, like it basically it's kind of proprietary, but I don't know. Like still cool, like a cool idea for a function. It's just ultimately not that useful. Similarly, we have the Sub-Zero Sense. So literally a K-type thermocouple thermometer built directly into the motherboard. Now, the problem with this is if the motherboard is not on, you don't really have any way of checking the actual temperature. So if you cold boot, like if you have a cold bug or a cold, well, yeah, if you have a cold bug and the system shuts down, you ain't gonna know what temperature it shut down at because it locked up, right? So that's kind of, and then when you're trying to restart it, it's gonna be kind of awkward to figure out where the cold boot bug is. So yeah, and this also got moved off motherboard into the ROG OC panel eventually. But still, this is like this is similar. It's like cool idea. And actually, the ROG OC panel implementation of this is really useful. Like that's actually kind of the main use of my OC panel that I've had. Like I have a ROG OC panel, and this is like the main reason I use it is the K-type thermocouple thermometer built into it. Because honestly, like the VGA hot wire thing, cool idea, not that useful. It's also useful as like extra fan headers. The OC panel is. Anyway, so moving on further along the bottom, this side of the motherboard, we've got a BIOS switch for the two socketed BIOS chips. So even if you bricked both of them, you could just replace it if necessary, right? Or you could pull it and use like a hardware flasher. But let's say you somehow actually broke the BIOS chip to the point that it was totally unrecoverable, no matter what you do. Well, you can just get a replacement one very easily. So yeah, I really think like. And the funny thing is, socketed BIOS chips used to be like really the norm for a lot of motherboards back in the day, and now it's like these days all of them are just soldered on, and it's just like I kind of preferred the not that I ever had to use not that I ever had to actually replace a BIOS chip, but I still think more like to me, it doesn't seem like it should add much cost, and it's just like, well, replaceable BIOS chips are well replaceable. That's better. Like if you ever do something really stupid to it, you can just replace it. So yeah. Anyway, then we got the PCIe slots, which well, I have the clips broken off, and this is something I do for basically, though admittedly this is like not a very clean way of breaking them off. There's a trick to actually getting just the, like you can do this much more cleanly than I did it on this board. But it took me several attempts to figure out the cleaner method. Like I think even on my Maximus 9 Apex, I have the clips broken off pretty awfully. But then on later boards, I finally figured out the trick to it, and it's just like, well, hard to explain. I'm not going to explain it, but there's a trick to not having the motherboard end up not having the PCIe slot end up mangled like this. The reason why you do this is if you're using a horizontal, like if you have the motherboard on a test bench, the retention clip doesn't really do anything for you. And if you're swapping GPUs regularly, it just gets annoying, especially if you have a GPU with like an awkward backplate or you know, a big air cooler on the CPU or something like that. It's just annoying to deal with. So no clips on a lot of my motherboards, actually. Like this is not the only one where I don't have any clips on it, but a lot of the other ones are cleaner. Now, the other thing about this PCIe slot layout is, in my opinion, this is the best PCIe slot layout ever, because you can run 4 dual slot cards, 3 triple slot cards, and then the flexibility is ridiculous. So you can put a dual slot here, and then you can go single, single, dual, dual. So you can actually have like, you know, I don't know, like, well, you could have like a capture card, sound card, 3 GPUs, right? Like super, super flexible layout. That isn't as ridiculous as because there are some high-end HEDT motherboards out there which are more targeted at workstations where you'll just get you'll get 16, 16, 16, 16, 16, 16, 16, right? Which on a lot of motherboards is not practical. Like there's, as you can clearly see, there's a lot of things that go here where the PCIe slot would be. So those would have to get shuffled around if you did that, and that can lead, well, that just adds to the expense of the board. So yeah, but this layout I think is the best PCIe slot layout out there, because again, like you can run triple GPU, like triple slot, triple GPU on triple slot cards, quad GPU on dual slot, and if you're not actually using like big multi GPU setups, you still have like a lot of flexibility in terms of what PCIe slots you use. And actually, if you use just dual two triple slot cards, right, you can go for like, you'll take up those and take up those, and you'll still have an X16 slot that you can use for like a capture card or something, which is like, basically this is the most flexible PCIe slot layout out there. And yeah, I really like it. I really wish there was more motherboards with it, but this unfortunately, due to M.2 SSDs, this layout is going away. Which yeah, because they normally like they cram an M.2 SSD right here, and that's the end of this slot, right? Like this slot, in my opinion, makes this layout, because without this slot right here, if you go triple slot, well, that's it. Goodbye. There are no more PCIe lanes for you. So yeah, that's kind of that. But at the same time, I guess most people prefer having M.2 SSDs to just having, like, you know, a very large, like, odd combinations of PCIe add-in cards. Anyway, up here we have a 6-pin power connector for extra PCIe slot power, and then above that we have a 4-pin floppy connector for extra memory VRM power, which just seems really unnecessary, but sure. Hey, like, I don't think there's any other ASUS motherboard that comes with this, but, or I might be wrong. No, I don't think there's, well, this is the only motherboard I'm aware of where this is a thing, because I saw that connector and I was like, what the hell is that? And it's like, oh, that's, and then, like, because I actually went through the motherboard manual for this thing because it's been a while since I last used it, so I don't remember everything off the top of my head. I was like, wait, what? Extra DIMM slot power? Like, really? But yeah, apparently this is for extra power to the memory VRMs, which is just like I'd be really surprised if the 24-pin wasn't capable of providing that. Maybe if you were running like 8 gig DIMMs and 8 of them, and then also running them at like high frequency, which would be very hard to do because this motherboard uses a daisy chain. But hey, sure, like, it definitely doesn't harm anything by existing. It's just kind of weird that it exists at all. Also, I'm not sure if it's this connector right here, but no, we'll not get into that. But basically, actually, no, we will get into that. This motherboard, okay, yeah, it is this connector. So this motherboard has this, I'm not sure what to call it. I guess you could call it a dongle, but basically it's it's called the Direct OC key, and it's basically a thing that goes onto the DVI port of your GPU. And it gives you an on-screen, like, overlay, on-screen display overlay, with overclocking settings for the motherboard, and I think your keyboard even plugs into it. I've not used that very much either, but basically, yeah, you get like, instead of having to install some kind of software in Windows to do overclocking, you basically get this like hardware device that goes between the motherboard and the monitor, like between your GPU and your monitor, and gives you overclocking settings through that, which is pretty neat. But ultimately that got replaced by the ROG OC panel as well, because the OC panel allows you to tweak things like CPU ratio and I think even voltages. Though the thing is just, well, I never really used the OC panel that much for really controlling my motherboard either, just because Turbo V Core is more convenient. But yeah, still, I like, the thing is, now that, like, I do want to revisit this motherboard like a lot. I've been like, but yeah, it's just like because, and I actually do still have the direct OC key. I didn't manage to lose that. I lost the LN2 mode jumper, but I didn't lose the OC key. So, yeah, we'll definitely like. I definitely want to try that thing out again because it's just like, yeah, I don't remember using it very much. And honestly, kind of like now, this thing actually sounds like a cool idea compared to say you know, your motherboard acting as your thermometer. This doesn't seem like a cool idea. Anyway, so that's that. Up here, you get a BIOS flashback button and a clear CMOS button in the rear I/O. And then this red button, which kind of looks like another clear CMOS, is actually it's called the Q reset button. And apparently it resets the VRM controllers. I assume the motherboard maybe has some kind of situation where it gets locked up into a, like the VRM locks up into a safety. And the thing is, if you want to clear VRM faults, normally you have to power cycle them, just completely power cycle them. So I guess that button just does that for you. So yeah, again, like this is one of the features I had to read the manual for because I don't remember ever using it. So it's just like, well, that like I can't really think of any motherboards where I've had like, because here's the thing, I've tripped OCP on like GPUs. Actually, yeah, no, I've tripped OCP on like GPUs and stuff, and normally if you just reset this, like shut the computer down completely and not disconnect AC power, just shut down and then power up again, the VRM resets just doing that. But I guess it might be a bit different for this board depending on how the VRM controllers are actually powered. So yeah, it just seems like this seems kind of like it might be a requirement of how the board is designed rather than a general useful feature that you'd like to have on other motherboards as well. So yeah, that's that. Anyway, that covers basically all of the extreme overclocking features that like I've managed to well, kind of, you know, notice on the motherboard. There might be something I'm missing, but yeah, I did have to dig through the manual for this one because it's just like there's too much stuff on this board and it's been way too long since I last used it. So anyway, let's move on to the VRMs. And of course, we're going to start with the most important one. Though it is not in like all of this is actually not it. It's just this part because this is the vCore VRM. This over here is the VCCSA, so that's the system agent power. Man, that is great, right? Like lowercase c's and then capital S in it. Well, A is capital, whatever. I'm used to only seeing VCCSA with a capital A, so that's what's going on there. Anyway, so yeah, VCCSA vCore. Now vCore is an 8-phase, and it's controlled by this chip over here, which that is a rebrand called the ASP1000. I don't know what it actually is. It's probably like it's an international rectifier or chill 8-phase controller. I'm just not sure which specific part it's a rebrand of. But yeah, it's not going to be anything like super custom or anything. It's just going to be a rebranded thing from IR. And ASUS does this because they like to brand everything Digi Plus. And it's just incredibly stupid, in my opinion, because it makes looking up their controllers really difficult and annoying. So, yeah, it's just like I wish I could give you more details on that, but it's it's almost certainly just like the highest end international rectifier or chill controller you could get at the time. So, you know, it's not going to be anything bad. It's just like I wish I knew what it was specifically. But yeah, you know. The ASUS motherboards, you kind of get used to the whole everything is rebranded. At least recently, there's not been a bunch of different controllers, so it's just like, yeah, the ASP1405 has been the same, like, they've used one on so many boards, and it's like, it's almost certainly a 35201, because it matches the feature set of a 35201 so closely. But, and actually, I think if I hook up the USB, I've still not hooked up the USB 005 dongle I have to any of my ASUS boards, but I'm pretty sure, like, if I do, it's gonna give it away. Like, if the register map looks exactly the same for both of the chips, for both of the controllers, and the feature sets are the same, then it's just like, yeah, it's a 35201. Anyway, so yeah, I don't know what this is though. That's not a 3520 on. I mean, on like the newer ASUS boards. So that's what's going on with the control scheme. And actually, we need to go take a look at the back of the board because, yeah, so these chips right over here are the drivers. And we do have 8 of them because, well, it is an 8-phase. So those are all CHL8510s. And this is a really common driver for any international rectifier VRM design where you need a lot of actual, like where you need a strong driver. Because the thing is, you could actually, like, since this is a 8-phase, you could theoretically have used just like 4 drivers instead. Well, you'd still need 8 drivers, but you could have used like an IR3598 instead of a CHL8510. Because the 3598 basically integrates 2 drivers into one chip. So, you know, you could simplify the board layout a bit and save on cost as well. But the IR3598 is not as it's not as strong a driver as the CHL8510. So this can switch higher capacitance MOSFETs much faster than a 3598 does. Which is why we basically have all of these CHL8510s here instead of a bunch of, you know, instead of just like 4 3598s. I guess the other thing is that they have CHL8510s all over the place for the rest of the... I wonder if the 3598 existed at this point in time. Probably did. It's not really that special. It's just 2 drivers in a chip. Yeah, so CHL8510, very common on a lot of AMD GPUs, especially because AMD likes their direct FETs, and well, the low side MOSFETs that you get for direct FETs, yeah, high capacitance, very high capacitance. So you need a pretty strong driver like an 8510 to deal with those. So yeah, anyway, so these chips on the back and also on the front of the board, so all of these, and then of course on the front of the board, these are... We've seen them before, CSD 87350s, and these are 40 amp dual NFETs from Texas Instruments. I almost said International Rectifier, but no, this is Texas Instruments. And yeah, this is just a dual NFET. Just ASUS really likes to use them, ASRock really likes to use them, and they're good. Like they are really good. And yeah, we got 16 of these here in this 8-phase VRM because you basically get 2 of them in each phase running in parallel. Now, the funny thing is that's not that special, like having 2 of them in parallel in each phase, but having only, like, the thing is there's a lot of motherboards where they'd add an extra inductor just to make the VRM look more substantial than it is. But obviously there's not enough space to do that on a board there's not enough space for more inductors here, so... Yeah, you get an 8-phase that it's an 8-phase and it also looks like an 8-phase rather than an 8-phase where you have literally if you just added an inductor to each phase, then it's just like, oh, now it looks like a 16, but it isn't. But yeah, so that. It's also quite common on GPUs to see I don't think I've seen no, NVIDIA reference boards will often, not often, but there's some NVIDIA reference cards that'll have 2 dual NFETs in parallel as well. Because the easiest way to get more power handling capacity out of a VRM if you're using dual NFETs is just use 2 of them instead of 1. Bam, right? Half the resistance. So yeah. So what this means for the efficiency of the VRM is the following. At 1.3 volts output voltage, 500 kilohertz switching frequency, and 5 volts gate to source voltage, which actually you can crank up the gate to source voltage on this board. This board has variable gate drive, which is hiding right behind here. It's basically a little mini buck converter. And if I remember correctly, you can actually set the VRM operating voltage between 5 and 10 volts, gate to source. Which if we look at the RDS on curves for the CSD 87350s, we can see that at 5 volts, you get this much RDS on, or this much, depending on the operating temperature, right? So this is if it's running very hot, this is if it's running very cool, ridiculously cool. Realistically, you're probably going to be somewhere in between the two. But anyway, the point is, can see that here we're let's say 2.2. Well, if you bump up the voltage to say 7 volts, you get a little bit more efficiency, or maybe 8 volts, you might get a little bit more efficiency. Now, the thing is, There are also added driver losses. So, yeah, sure, your on state resistance gets reduced, but your the actual like energy you need to switch the MOSFET on and off increases. So that's kind of the trade-off. So it doesn't make sense to necessarily just crank the voltage all the way up to say 10 volts, because at some point, like, you can see that the RDS on improvements sort of level out, right? Like, it's more curved towards this end than this end. Here it's more of a straight line. So if you went to like 12 volts, you would probably just increase the switch, just increase the driving losses and not actually improve the RDS on a, noteworthy amount at all. And so your efficiency would actually go down past a certain point. But anyway, maybe up to around 7 or 8 volts, the efficiency would actually improve, which is pretty neat. So that's for the low side MOSFET. Then for the high side MOSFET, which, is also called the control MOSFET, you get this curve. But the thing is, the control MOSFET doesn't handle anywhere near as much current as the low side MOSFET, and now I'm interchanging them, so that's going to be confusing. But yeah, so the low side MOSFET, is going to be handling anywhere between like 80 and 90% of the current going through the VRM, whereas this one handles like 10 to 20%. So, like reducing the resistance of this MOSFET doesn't make as much of a difference to your heat output as reducing the resistance of the low side MOSFET. So, yeah. Anyway, for convenience, I just did everything at 5 volts gate to source voltage because that's what the data sheet is spec'd in, and I didn't really feel like figuring out what it would be like the efficiency at 7 volts versus at 10 volts versus at 10 volts, which is the maximum voltage. So yeah, didn't want to bother with that, just spec'd at 5 volts. So let's go with it. Let's go through it. So 100 amps, this VRM will kick out about 13 watts of heat. 200 amps, it'll kick out about 24 watts of heat. 300 amps, it'll kick out about 42 watts of heat. And 400 amps, it'll produce about 64 watts of heat. Yes, we'll keep going. Admittedly, some of these current draws are, completely unrealistic for the platform, but hey, that hasn't stopped me before from going up to really insane insane current outputs. So if you're actually if you're overclocking a Sandy Bridge E CPU, you're going to stay in this range. Like, the funny thing about Sandy Bridge E is it scales with voltage great, and if you have a big enough water cooling loop, you can actually, let's put it this way. I measured close to 450 watts going into the 8-pin and the 4-pin power connector of this VRM on water cooling. With the 3960X, admittedly at like over 1.6 volts, but that still means that, the VRM was probably kicking out over 250 amps. So yeah, somewhere in this range. For day-to-day usage, you'd be 200 amps, or you'd be staying 200 amps or lower, where the efficiency of this VRM is actually really good. That's 91.5% efficiency right there. And that's assuming high operating temperatures. At lower operating temperatures, it would actually get more efficient. And 300 amps, you're looking at 91%, actually just 90% efficiency there. But so yeah, 42 watts. Well, the thing is I had the board on water cooling because even though this is actually relatively efficient at 91.5%, the issue is that you have 12 watts of heat getting produced on this side of the board, and that's easy to deal with well enough, but the other 12 watts of heat are produced here. And the only way, there's no way you're getting a heatsink behind the board. So yeah, basically this VRM runs really hot, not because it's super inefficient, but because it's too cramped, and because half of it basically is rather starved for cooling. So I actually had my Rampage 4 Extreme water cooled, and I still have all of the water cooling stuff on it. Because yeah, water cooling this VRM is actually really good for the VRM, because otherwise it does run very, very hot. Yeah, that's entirely down to the fact that half the VRM is on the back of the board, which is not uncommon for X79 boards. Like, there's quite a few of them where it's like half the VRM's on the back of the board and it runs hot. So That's just an issue of motherboards where, you know, you have to squeeze a high current output VRM in between all of these DIMM slots, and if you don't want to make the board XLATX, well, you just kind of don't have a choice. There's just not enough space. So yeah, while the VRM is quite efficient, water cooling, especially since I was, you know, hammering the CPU when I was using this board, not always, like not, you know, 24/7, but when I took it out for a spin, especially in say Cinebench, I was not gentle with the voltage whatsoever. I'm actually surprised the 3960X still works. But yeah, because of that, it's just like I did have the VRM1 water cooling because it just gets really, really hot, even if it's even as efficient as it is. Because the thing is the best way to cool the back of the board is essentially just to make sure that the front of the board is very, very cool. Right, because if the front of the board is cool, then the heat that the back of the board produces will just sink through the board and through the front of the, like through the top side MOSFETs and into the water cooling as well. So yeah, that's the best way to try to cool this, because you're not actually going to get a heatsink behind the board unless you have some very exotic, like, you know, case setup. And even then you'd probably need to do something about the airflow situation behind the board. So yeah. The easiest way to deal with is water cool the VRM, and then this side runs so cool that the back side actually ends up cool as well. So, yeah, that's the VRM situation here. It's efficient. It's just thermally, it's a disaster because all of the heat is produced in a very small amount of area. Also about the power connectors on this, you do get an 8 and a 4 pin, which is actually, like, as I said, I had, like, on the daily settings that I ran on my 3960X would easily pull over 300 watts. So this is actually a platform where, you know, having an 8 pin and a 4 pin is actually a pretty reasonable power connector is a reasonable power connector choice. Right, there's a lot of other platforms where it's just like just the 8 pin alone is plenty. And the thing is, honestly, for my daily settings, you know, the 8 pin on its own was fine. It's just that when you shove over 1.6 volts into the CPU and then decide to run Cinebench, the single 8 pin is no longer fine because it'll start pulling close to 400, 450, even, well, I don't think I ever measured 500 watts, but yeah, it'll pull a ridiculous amount of power if you start, if you run Cinebench at high voltages, which, because Sandy Bridge scales so well with voltage and it's not very hard to cool, well, I went for it. So yeah, that's why, you know, this power connector combination makes a lot of sense, especially considering that this board uses the, you know, these are just the folded metal pins instead of like the solid pins. So that's actually the lower current variant of the power connector, not the high current variant. So each of these connectors is only good for like 384 watts, whereas if you had the high current variant, then it would be like 480 watts or more, depending on also what cabling your power supply has. So yeah, that's that. So that's the V-Core. Then for VCCSA, we're just looking at more CSD 87350s. Now, the VCCSA, so my experience with VCCSA, at least on my CPU, was that if you raised it above 0.95 volt, like, there was no point raising that voltage, is basically what my experience was. It's just like, if you raised it, it just got unstable. It wouldn't train, it wouldn't post, it wouldn't, like, you couldn't do as high memory overclocks at high VCCSA as you could do at 0.95 volts VCCSA, which is just like, which I think is actually technically slightly below stock, which is just kind of hilarious. And I've actually had a lot of other people, well, I've suggested to a lot of people over time that, you know, have been overclocking Sandy Bridge E and Ivy Bridge E CPUs that, hey, you should try 0.95 volts VCCSA for stabilizing your memory overclock. And a lot of the time, you know, that actually helps people with their memory stability. So it's just like, yeah, this VRM right here, like, it was very overbuilt because you're never going to actually, like, you're probably going to end up slightly undervolting it because it seems to sweet spot super hard at a rather low voltage. So yeah, anyway, it is a 3-phase controlled by this chip over here, which that's a where is it? That's an ASP 1101. Yeah. SP1101, which I think is a chip ASUS uses even now on motherboards, which really isn't that surprising because, you know, if you don't need anything super special for a voltage, then why would you change it? But yeah, that's a 3-phase. And then, yeah, you've got the CSD 87350s. And the efficiency of this VRM is it'll do 20 amps while producing about 2.5 watts of heat. It'll do 40 amps while producing about 5 watts of heat. The Intel datasheet for this, for the LGA20, like for this platform, says that the maximum current on VCCSA is 24 amps. So yeah, this really isn't a heat output concern whatsoever. Like the big problem here is just like half the vCore is on the back of the board where there's just no way to really cool it. The VCCSA doesn't run into that issue because, well, half the there's no second half of the VCCSA that's in an awkward location on the board. It's all up here. And yes, this uses more CHL8510 drivers on the back of the board, which you would have noticed when we were on that side. So yeah, that's the main CPU power delivery, right? VCCSA I'd say is really overkill. The vCore here is like, it's a nice vCore VRM and it's not, you know, it's not undersized. It's just, well, thermally, this is a absolute, like, it's too, like, it runs hot because of how, like, the thermal management situation is just, terrible, which is kind of the norm for X79 boards. This is definitely not, like, the worst, like, this is far from the worst X79 motherboard VRM. Actually, I'm pretty sure this was one of the best. If not the best, until some of the refresh boards came out. So, yeah, because there was a second round. Like, this motherboard launched with the Sandy Bridge E CPUs, and there was a bunch of motherboards that got released after the Ivy Bridge E CPUs came out. So, yeah, but out of the initial round of Sandy Bridge E motherboards, I think this was basically the best. There's a small chance that the MSI X-Power Big Bang 2 X-Power, I can't remember the name of that thing, but MSI had a motherboard that was XL-ATX, and I think they actually squeezed like a larger VRM onto that because they shifted everything down. So that might have been the only motherboard that actually like offered a better VRM than this in terms of power handling capability. I'm not sure if that one was any better on voltage regulation. So yeah, but the thing is just like back in the day, I didn't really like back in the day when, you know, these platforms were relevant, I didn't really know that much and I didn't pay that much attention to all of the boards. So, and as much as I'd like to go back and like try retest some of the flagship X79 boards against each other, I have way too much old junk lying around that I should work on first before doing any of that. And I have an X79 UD7 from Gigabyte board, so I can still compare against that. So I'll probably do that comparison. Though the other thing to consider is that I did overheat the VRM on this thing a couple times to the point like that the board actually straight up shut down on me, which is why it eventually ended up on water cooling. The other part of why it ended up on water cooling. So there's maybe a chance that the capacitors might not be in the greatest condition ever on mine. But we can check that, right? Like if it turns out that it's producing terrible results on the oscilloscope, then we can safely assume that I probably degraded the VRM. And if it blows everything away, then even if it's degraded, it's better than all the other than any other board I've found, right? Like, so it's still a win. Which, speaking of the capacitors, these are all Nichicon FP series 10,000 hours rated. So they're like high endurance capacitors, except like this board's also really old, right? Like this thing's from like, because I actually have one that was like initial release. So mine is early 2012, I think, is when I got it. So this board's 7 years old. Still works too. Like it still works. I've just not like pushed it really hard recently. It's just I've checked that it runs and everything, cleaned it up, and then put it back in its box and taken pictures of it for this PCB breakdown. So anyway, that's the CPU power delivery. Let's talk about the memory. That's the main CPU power delivery. Then down here we have the VTT VRM. So this is the actual memory controller voltage. This is what on later this is roughly what on later platforms is referred to as VCCIO. So yeah, that's just to give you some idea of what this equates to, because VTT is a voltage that, well, this hasn't been a voltage that like is a thing. Well, no, there's like VTT DDR, but that's a completely different voltage for completely different things from like the VTT voltage that Intel CPUs used to have, and it basically just got renamed to VCCI. Like, there's probably a technical reason for it, but the closest equivalent is VCCIO on the more recent CPUs. So anyway, the controller for this is a UP 1606. So that, surprisingly enough, isn't a rebrand, which, yep, that's very surprising. We've got just some basic dual NFETs from discrete MOSFETs from On Semiconductor here. And this is fine because this is also like, this is a very low current rail, and also it's not sitting right next to a massive heat source. It's actually in one of the coolest spots on the board because, well, there's not really anything around here that'll get particularly hot. So yeah, I just don't really have any details. Actually, I did pull up the data sheet for these, and then I think I decided, oh, these are boring. I think they're 9 milliohm, 9 milliohm RDS on, which is rather high, but at the same time, this is a low power rail. So yeah, and it is a two-phase. So that's that. Surprised that ASUS didn't rebrand that, because the memory VRMs, which one of them is this mess over here. Actually, I can highlight all of it. Cool. So that mess over here is the VDDR for these DIMMs, and by mess, I mean, look at this Mosfet layout. Like, actually, it makes sense. Like, you have your low side MOSFETs here, you have your high side MOSFET here, so then you have your 16 volt, like, basically you have all of your plus 12 volts over here, so like, the layout makes sense, because then you have something that looks like this for your 12 volts, then you have ground come in like this, then you have a switch node that looks like that, then you have your inductor, right? So it actually, like, it makes perfect sense if you think about it from like, oh yeah, that's actually a reasonable layout, especially because you can like connect that MOSFET, like, you basically have something that looks like that, just a little square for the switch node, but still, it looks a bit like a mess, because normally you'll have the MOSFETs in a rather different layout. But anyway, yeah, you've got one high side, two low sides, one high side and two more low sides. Same MOSFETs as these, and I think they're 4928 from On 4928 from On Semiconductor. I swear I copy pasted that into my notes. Why isn't it in? Well, whatever. Yeah, doesn't really matter. Like, actually, I don't know how much power DDR3 pulls. It can't be that much because the sticks don't really get that hot. But yeah, I really underestimated how much power DDR4 pulls, and DDR4 should be more efficient than should be more efficient than DDR3. So there's like, I'm not gonna try to make any statements about this. But still, two-phase memory power is generally kind of like, well, the MOSFETs here are definitely smaller than what you'd see on some other motherboards, but just the fact that it's two-phase memory power instead of single-phase is already like, yeah, that's better than what you get in a lot of cases. Like, this is, you know, I guess you could say above average. Also, we have a bunch of SMD aluminum polymer capacitors for the memory filtering going for because your memory power plane is going to look like that. So, you know, it goes to the CPU as well. So you have these capacitors right here, and actually on the back of the board, you also have those. So there's 4 of them in total, and they're 150 microfarads each. So yeah, pretty interesting output filter. Then the other memory VRM is over here. And this one is more of a mess because you can't even see all of the MOSFETs in it. So I think it's high side, low side, high side. No, that doesn't make sense because we have 12 volts in the center here, right? Yeah. No, that. Wait. Oh no, wait. I am now very confused. Because you have this. Okay, this. Wait. Oh, right. Wait. That runs off of 5 volts, doesn't it? Right. Yeah. That's why they need the freaking floppy for extra memory power. Right. So you're gonna have something. Wait. Not 12. I'm dumb. Whatever. Yeah. So this wouldn't be plus 12. It would be plus 5. There. Going into the memory VRM. And the reason why you use the higher, like the 5 volt rail for your memory power instead of the 12 volt rail is because it raises your efficiency because you're putting less strain on the high side MOSFET. Actually, no, you put less load onto your low side MOSFET. So you spread the load between the MOSFETs more evenly. So you get slightly better efficiency out of it. It's kind of like how, if you run if you raise the output voltage of a VRM from like 1.3 volts to 2 volts, your heat output increases, but it increases slower than your efficiency, than your power output increases. So that's why at higher voltages you get better efficiency. So that's the same idea of why you would actually run a lower voltage into your memory VRM because, like the reason why vCore is fed off of a plus 12 volt rail is because you need ridiculous, like if it was 5 volts, you need like ridiculous amounts of current, and then that becomes a power loss problem because you need a ton of current traveling over your cables, right? And it's just that becomes a mess. So you use a higher voltage so you can use less current when you're transferring the power long distances. But when you've got something like memory power, which doesn't pull that much power in the first place, well, you can just run it off a straight 5 volts because you don't need that much current, right? So yeah, that's the idea behind that. So anyway, here you'd have something that looks like this will be high side. Yeah, you'll have high side, low side, and then when we go on the back of the board, the thing is they're all labeled the same thing, and no, there is an easy way to figure it out. And then on the back of the board, we get the CHL8510s and the other low side MOSFET. And unfortunately, they both look exactly the same, even though one of them does have more leg. Okay, this is going to be the low side MOSFET. Actually, that could be... No, that's the low side. That's definitely the low side, and I'm probably wrong about that. Anyway, but these should be the CHL8510s. And I'm saying those are the CHL8510s because those... with the very few pixels that we have here, these look like they have more legs. So that's going to be the CHL8510s, which ASUS is just using for drivers everywhere on this board. But like here they actually are like a good fit for the MOSFETs. Here it's just kind of like, well, we're using them in the vCore anyway, so you might as well use them for the memory power. So yeah, that's the memory power delivery. And then for the actual memory trace layout, we are looking at a daisy chain. As you can clearly see, the trace goes in, hits one of the pins, goes on, hits the other pin, instead of doing like a T-topology split. And then here you can see this one, and then goes to this one, and this one goes like so, and then like squeezes around that one right there, right? So... yeah, and similarly, you can see this one. So yeah, this is a daisy chain topology, which does mean that this biases to the outer DIMM slots. So that's the red ones, which is why those are red, right? Like that's the main reason why those are red, is because that's the ones that are the best for memory clock speeds on this board, because it does use a daisy chain topology. And so that is it for the Rampage 4 Extreme. It's everything I have to say about this board. It's quite the art. Like the funny thing, like here's the thing. It is my first motherboard, so I kind of want, like, I'd like to say it's the best motherboard ever, but at the same time, it's just like, you might just be, like, it's been a while since I've last used it. If I'm not mistaken, the postcode on mine actually well, no, my postcode's in a weird condition on mine. Like, it sometimes works, sometimes doesn't. But the thing is just like, yeah, I've not used it in so long that calling it the best motherboard ever at this point kind of just sounds like nostalgia talking, and not actual real, well, yeah, but definitely, like, I definitely put this as a contestant for best board I've ever used. Because the thing is, well, I definitely liked my Rampage 4 Extreme a lot more than I like the Rampage 5 Extreme. But I think that's mostly down to Haswell E being god-awful, not so much the board's fault. Yeah, anyway, so that's the Rampage 4 Extreme. Thanks for watching. Like, share, subscribe, leave any comments, questions, suggestions down in the comment section below. And if you'd like to support what I do here with actually hardcore overclocking, I have a Patreon where you can support me directly. There's a link to that down in the description below. Or if you don't want to use that and you just want to pick, like, you want to instead get some, merch, like shirts, stickers, posters, that kind of thing, there's the actually hardcore overclocking Teespring store. There's a link to that down in the description below as well. Both Patreon and Teespring help out immensely with running the channel. So yeah, if you'd like to help out that way, that would be awesome. And that's it for the video. So thanks for watching and goodbye. Got to find the stop button.